Hello. Tonight I'm taking you on a journey into the history of coffee. But this is not just the story of a drink. It is a story of the rise and fall of empires, the sparks of revolutions, and the reshaping of the world. You will see how a black, bitter, aromatic liquid came to write the pages of history books. Prepare yourself for a long, slow journey. A journey stretching from the high mountains of Ethiopia to Ottoman coffee houses, from Europe's revolutionary cafes to America's halls of independence. If stories like this bring you a sense of calm, you may like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Don't forget to write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something strangely comforting about knowing that others are drifting off to sleep while listening to the same old stories. So dim the lights, let the steam of coffee whisper its stories, and let us begin. From the very beginning, before coffee became a morning ritual, before it was sold in paper cups with names misspelled in marker, before it fueled late-night studying, and before it became the fuel of corporate meetings, it was something else entirely. It was a secret. It was a mystery. It was a discovery that would, in time, reshape empires, finance revolutions, and quietly alter the course of human civilization. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back, far back, to a time when coffee did not yet even have a name in most languages, to the high mountains of Ethiopia, where the air is thin, the slopes are steep, and the forests are filled with plants that have grown there for thousands of years, unnoticed by most of the world. Of course, there are legends. There always are. One of the most famous involves a goat herder named Kaldi. The story goes like this. Kaldi, sometime around the 9th century, though no one knows for certain, was tending his goats somewhere in the Ethiopian highlands. He was an ordinary man doing an ordinary job, watching his animals graze, making sure none of them wandered off a cliff or were eaten by something with sharper teeth. But one day, Kaldi noticed something strange. His goats, normally calm, predictable creatures, were behaving differently. They were energetic, almost frantic. They jumped, bleated loudly, and refused to sleep even after night fell. Confused, and perhaps a little worried that his goats were losing their minds, Kaldi began to investigate. He followed them. He watched them, and eventually he saw what they were eating. Bright red berries from a particular shrub, vivid and glowing against dark green leaves. The goats seemed to love them. They devoured the berries eagerly, and the more they ate, the more animated they became. Curious, and perhaps a little desperate to understand what was happening to his livelihood, Kaldi tried the berries himself. He slowly chewed the mildly sweet flesh surrounding the seeds, and then he waited. According to legend, the effect was immediate. Kaldi felt more awake, more alert. His fatigue seemed to lift like morning fog. His thoughts sharpened. Lacking a better word, he felt more alive than he had just minutes before. Excited, or perhaps simply deeply confused, Kaldi brought the berries to a local monastery. He showed them to the monks and explained what had happened. The monks, being monks, were skeptical. They had devoted their lives to prayer and contemplation, and this seemed like the work of something that could be distracting, or worse, unholy. According to the story, one monk was so suspicious of the berries that he declared them dangerous and threw them into the fire. But as the berries burned, something unexpected happened. A scent began to fill the room, rich, deep, intoxicating. The monks, despite themselves, were drawn to it. Someone had the idea to pull the roasted seeds from the fire, grind them, and steep them in hot water. And when they drank the resulting liquid, dark, bitter, and strange, they discovered that it allowed them to stay awake during long hours of night prayer. They could focus, they could think, they could worship longer, with greater intensity. And so, according to legend, coffee was born. Now, is this story true? Probably not. At least, not in the way it is usually told. Legends like this are almost never historically accurate. They are simplified, dramatized, reshaped by centuries of retelling, until whatever truth may exist is buried beneath layers of narrative and myth. But the essence, the core of it, is likely grounded in reality. Coffee did in fact originate in Ethiopia. The coffee plant, Coffea arabica, is native to the region, and it is entirely reasonable that someone, at some point, noticed the effects of the berries and began experimenting with them. What we know for certain is this. By the 15th century, coffee was being cultivated and consumed on the Arabian Peninsula, particularly in Yemen. It had crossed the Red Sea, carried by merchants, travellers, or perhaps enslaved people who knew its secrets. And in Yemen, it began a new life. The Sufi monks of Yemen were among the first to formally adopt coffee. They did not use it for pleasure, but for practicality. Their religious practices involved long nights of prayer, meditation, and chanting. Coffee helped them stay awake. It sharpened their focus. It allowed them to commune with the divine for hours without surrendering to exhaustion. They called the drink kawa, a term that originally referred to wine, but came to mean coffee. The connection makes sense. Both wine and coffee alter the mind, but in very different ways. One dulls it, the other sharpens it. One is forbidden in Islam, the other became a tool of devotion. From the Sufi monasteries, coffee began to spread. It moved into the cities. It became more than a religious aid. It became social, cultural, political. By the 16th century, coffee houses, kahve-khane, began to appear in the cities of the Middle East: Mecca, Medina, Cairo, Damascus, Istanbul. These were not merely places to drink coffee, they were gathering spaces. People came to talk, to debate, to listen to music and poetry. They played chess and backgammon. They discussed theology, philosophy and politics. And this almost immediately made them dangerous, because when people gather, speak freely, and think critically, power grows uneasy. The coffee houses of the Ottoman Empire and the Arab world quickly became sites of political tension. Rulers and religious authorities regarded them with suspicion. Who could know what kinds of ideas were being shared over thick cups of black coffee in those dimly lit rooms? In Mecca, in 1511, a man named Kher Beg, the local governor, actually attempted to ban coffee. He claimed it was intoxicating, that it led to immoral behaviour, and that it posed a threat to public order. He argued that coffee houses encouraged idleness and gossip, and worse, that they fueled dissent. But the ban did not last. Coffee was too popular, too deeply woven into daily life. And when the Sultan in Istanbul heard of the prohibition, he overturned it. He liked coffee, and he was not about to let a provincial governor take it away from him. This tension between coffee as a social good and coffee as a potential threat would echo across centuries and continents. It is a theme we will return to again and again, because coffee, more than almost any other commodity, possesses this strange dual nature. It brings people together, but in doing so, it empowers them. And power, especially when it is diffuse and uncontrollable, frightens those who rule. But we are still in the 16th century, still in the Middle East. Coffee has not yet reached Europe. It has not crossed the Atlantic. The coffee houses of London, Paris, and Boston do not yet exist. The American Revolution will not be planned over coffee for another 200 years. So let us slow down. Let us sit for a moment in one of those early coffee houses in Istanbul in the 1550s. The room is crowded, hazy with the smoke of tobacco pipes. The air smells of roasted coffee, spices, and sweat. Men sit on low cushions, some leaning against the walls, others hunched over small tables. In one corner, a poet stands reciting verses. Some listen intently, others ignore him, lost in deep conversation. In the background, a game of backgammon clicks and clacks. Someone laughs, loud and sudden. Someone else is arguing, his voice rising, about theology or taxes or the price of grain. You sit in the corner with your small cup of coffee, simply watching. The coffee is thick, almost muddy, sweetened with sugar or spiced with cardamom. Strong, bitter. As you sip it slowly, you feel the warmth spread through your chest, the clarity seeping into your thoughts. You do not realize it yet, but you are part of something. Something that will outlast empires. Something that, in just a few short centuries, will travel the world and change everything. But for now, you are simply a person in a coffee house, drinking a strange and wonderful beverage, surrounded by strangers who, in this moment, are part of your world. And outside, the city hums. The empire expands. The future, as always, remains unwritten. But in part, it will be written by people in rooms like this. Drinking coffee, talking, thinking, planning. The seeds, quite literally, have been planted. By the early 1600s, coffee had become more than just a drink in the Ottoman Empire. It had become a phenomenon, a social institution. And like all institutions that gather people together in unofficial spaces, it made the powerful nervous. The coffee houses of Istanbul were packed every evening. Men from all walks of life, merchants, scholars, poets, labourers, soldiers, sat shoulder to shoulder, sipping thick, syrupy coffee from small ceramic cups. The atmosphere was electric with conversation. Ideas flowed as freely as the coffee itself, and that, for a sultan trying to maintain absolute control, was a problem. Sultan Murad IV, who ruled from 1623 to 1640, was not a man known for his tolerance. He was a warrior, a disciplinarian, a ruler who believed in order above all else. And he saw the coffee houses as breeding grounds for dissent, places where men gathered to complain about taxes, mock the government, and plot who knows what in the shadows. So in 1633, Murad IV did what authoritarian rulers often do when faced with something they can't control. He banned it. Coffee was outlawed. Coffee houses were closed. Anyone caught drinking coffee, or even possessing it, could be punished. Severely. The punishments were not subtle. There are accounts, possibly exaggerated but chilling nonetheless, of people being beaten, imprisoned, even executed for the crime of drinking coffee. Murad himself, according to some stories, would disguise himself and walk the streets at night, looking for violators. If he found someone drinking coffee, he might kill them on the spot. A bit extreme, even by Ottoman standards. But here's the thing about bans. They rarely work, especially when the thing being banned is beloved. Coffee didn't disappear, it went underground. People drank it in secret, in private homes, in hidden rooms. The coffee houses closed, yes, but the culture didn't die. It just waited. And when Murad IV died in 1640, coffee came roaring back. The coffee houses reopened, the cups were refilled, and the conversations, the debates, the dangerous flow of ideas, all resumed as if nothing had happened. Because coffee, by this point, was too embedded in Ottoman society to be erased. It was part of the social fabric. It was how people connected, how they did business, how they made sense of the world. Banning coffee was like trying to ban conversation itself. Impossible. But while the Ottomans were wrestling with coffee's social implications, the drink was beginning its journey westward. And when it arrived in Europe, it would cause an entirely different kind of revolution. Coffee first reached Europe through Venice. This makes sense. Venice was a trading hub, a city built on commerce and exchange, with strong ties to the Ottoman Empire. Venetian merchants brought many things back from the east: spices, silk, textiles, and sometime in the late 16th century, they brought coffee. At first, Europeans didn't quite know what to make of it. It was strange, bitter, foreign. Some called it the bitter invention of Satan. There was even a story, likely apocryphal, that Pope Clement VIII was asked to officially condemn coffee as a Muslim drink, something Christians should avoid. But according to the tale, the Pope decided to taste it first. He took a sip, paused, thought about it, and then, instead of condemning it, he reportedly said something along the lines of, "This Satan's drink is so delicious, it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it. We shall cheat Satan by baptizing it." Whether or not this actually happened is anyone's guess, but it's a good story, and it captures something true about coffee's reception in Europe. Initial suspicion gave way to curiosity, and curiosity gave way to obsession. By the mid-1600s, coffee houses began to appear in major European cities. The first one in England opened in Oxford in 1650, run by a man named Jacob. 2 years later, London got its first coffee house, in St Michael's Alley, Cornhill. It was opened by a Greek servant named Pasqua Rosé, who had learned the art of coffee making while working for a British merchant in the Ottoman Empire. The London coffee house was an instant hit. People flocked to it. They came for the novelty at first, this exotic drink from the East, but they stayed for something else. They stayed for the conversation. Because the English coffee house, like its Ottoman predecessor, quickly became more than just a place to drink. It became a social hub, a gathering place, a forum for discussion, debate, and the exchange of ideas. And in 17th century England, a time of political upheaval, religious tension and rapid social change that made coffee houses incredibly important. They were called penny universities. For the price of a penny, you could enter a coffee house, buy a cup of coffee, and sit for as long as you liked, listening to debates, reading newspapers, engaging in conversation. There were no class distinctions inside. A nobleman might sit next to a tradesman. A poet might argue with a scientist. Everyone was equal, at least in theory. This was radical. England was a deeply hierarchical society. Your birth determined your place. But in the coffee house, your ideas mattered more than your title. It was a space of intellectual meritocracy, however imperfect. Newspapers began to circulate in coffee houses. Pamphlets were read aloud. Political news was discussed openly. Scientific discoveries were debated. Literary works were critiqued. The coffee house became the beating heart of the public sphere, a concept that wouldn't be formally articulated until much later, but was being lived and practiced every day in these crowded, smoky rooms. And of course, this made the authorities nervous. Just as in the Ottoman Empire, the English government viewed coffee houses with suspicion. King Charles II, in 1675, actually tried to ban them. He issued a proclamation declaring that coffee houses were places where divers false, malicious and scandalous reports are devised and spread abroad to the defamation of His Majesty's government. In other words, people are talking, and some of what they're saying we don't like. The ban was supposed to take effect in January 1676, but there was immediate and fierce backlash. Coffee house owners protested. Patrons were outraged. The public outcry was so strong that Charles II, facing the very real possibility of riots, backed down. He rescinded the ban just 11 days before it was set to begin. Coffee had won. Again. The English coffee house culture exploded over the next few decades. By the early 1700s, there were thousands of coffee houses in London alone. They became specialised. Certain coffee houses became known as gathering places for specific groups. Writers went to Will's. Scientists frequented the Grecian. Merchants gathered at Lloyd's, which would eventually become Lloyd's of London, one of the world's most famous insurance companies. Yes, you read that right. Lloyd's of London started as a coffee house. Edward Lloyd opened his coffee shop in the 1680s, and it quickly became a favourite of sailors, ship captains, and merchants involved in maritime trade. They would gather there to hear news of ships, cargoes, and overseas ventures. Lloyd began posting shipping news on the walls. Merchants began arranging insurance deals over coffee, and over time, the coffee house evolved into an institution. The insurance market that still bears Lloyd's name grew directly out of those conversations in a smoky room where men sipped coffee and made deals. This is one of coffee's most understated powers. It creates spaces. Spaces for conversation, for connection, for collaboration. And in those spaces, things happen. Businesses are born, ideas are shared, movements begin. In France, the story was similar, though with its own distinct flavour. The first coffee house in Paris opened in 1672, but it was Café Procope, opened in 1686, that truly captured the imagination of Parisian society. Located in the Latin Quarter, near the Comédie Française, it became a magnet for writers, philosophers, and intellectuals. Voltaire was a regular, so was Rousseau. Diderot, d'Alembert, Benjamin Franklin when he was in Paris, even a young Napoleon Bonaparte, all spent time at Café Procope, drinking coffee, arguing, writing, thinking. The French Enlightenment, that great flowering of reason, science and philosophy, was fueled in no small part by coffee. The salons, those famous gatherings where ideas were debated and tested, often took place in or around coffee houses. The Encyclopédie, that monumental attempt to catalogue all human knowledge, was planned and discussed over countless cups of coffee. And when the French Revolution finally erupted in 1789, it's no coincidence that much of the planning, the debating, the rabble-rousing happened in the cafés of Paris. The Café de Foix, located in the Palais Royal, was where Camille Desmoulins stood on a table on July 12, 1789, and gave a fiery speech that helped spark the storming of the Bastille 2 days later. Coffee didn't cause the French Revolution, but it provided the space where revolutionary ideas could be born, nurtured, and spread. It gave people a place to gather, to talk, to organise. And in a society on the brink of upheaval, that was everything. By the 18th century, coffee had thoroughly infiltrated European society. It was no longer exotic, it was essential. It fueled the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the rise of capitalism, the birth of modern journalism. It was the drink of thinkers, of merchants, of rebels. And soon, it would cross the Atlantic. And when it did, it would find a new home. A place where coffee and politics would become so intertwined that even today, the connection remains. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Let's slow down. Let's sit for a moment in one of those London coffee houses in, say, 1710. The room is dim, lit by candles and the occasional oil lamp. The air is thick with smoke from tobacco pipes and the smell of roasting coffee beans. The walls are lined with wooden benches, and every seat is taken. A man in a worn coat reads aloud from a newspaper. Others listen, nodding, occasionally interjecting with comments or questions. In the corner, two men argue loudly about the nature of gravity. Newton's theories are still relatively new, and not everyone is convinced. At another table, a merchant scribbles notes, calculating profits from a shipment of tea. You sit near the window, cradling a cup of coffee in your hands. It's hot, strong, slightly gritty from the grounds that haven't fully settled. You sip it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through your chest, the familiar sharpening of your thoughts. Outside, London rumbles past. Carts, horses, shouts. But in here there's a strange kind of focus, a sense that something is happening. Ideas are forming, connections are being made. The world, in some small but significant way, is changing. And you, with your penny and your cup of coffee, are part of it. Coffee crossed the Atlantic not as a luxury, but as a necessity born of spite. And nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in the American colonies, where a simple beverage would become a symbol of resistance, identity, and eventually, revolution. In the early 18th century, the American colonists were, like their British cousins, tea drinkers. Tea was the drink of the British Empire, imported from China and India by the powerful East India Company, served in parlours and taverns from Boston to Charleston. It was civilised, proper, English. Coffee existed, of course. It had made its way to the colonies through Dutch and British traders. There were coffee houses in colonial cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, modelled after their European counterparts. But coffee was secondary. Tea ruled, that is, until the British government made a catastrophic miscalculation. The year was 1773. The British Empire, stretched thin by wars and debts, was looking for ways to extract more revenue from its American colonies. The colonies, for their part, were growing increasingly resentful of being taxed without having representation in Parliament. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," wasn't just a slogan, it was a grievance that had been building for years. The Tea Act of 1773 was meant to help the struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting local merchants. The British government thought this would be welcomed. After all, the tea would actually be cheaper. What they failed to understand was that the colonists weren't angry about the price. They were angry about the principle. The Act was seen as yet another example of British overreach, another attempt to control colonial commerce without colonial consent. And the response was swift and theatrical. On the evening of December 16th, 1773, a group of colonists, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 British ships docked in Boston Harbour. They were calm, organised, methodical. Over the course of 3 hours, they broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the harbour. Thousands of pounds of tea, worth a fortune, dissolved into the cold Atlantic water. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, wasn't really about tea. It was about autonomy, control, the right to govern oneself. But it had an immediate and practical consequence. Tea became unpatriotic. Almost overnight, drinking tea became a political statement. If you drank tea, you were a loyalist, a supporter of British tyranny. If you rejected tea, you were a patriot. And patriots needed something else to drink. Enter coffee. Coffee, which had always been available but never dominant, suddenly surged in popularity. It became the drink of the revolution, the beverage of choice for those who supported independence. Coffee houses, which had existed quietly in the background of colonial life, became centres of political activity. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, which served both ale and coffee, was nicknamed the headquarters of the revolution. It was here that the Sons of Liberty met, planned, and coordinated their resistance to British rule. Paul Revere, John Adams, James Otis, all were regulars. They drank coffee, talked strategy, and plotted the birth of a nation. The Merchants' Coffee House in New York served a similar function. It was where news was shared, pamphlets were distributed, and meetings were held. When the Declaration of Independence was first read publicly in New York on July 9, 1776, it was read aloud outside the coffee house to a gathered crowd. Coffee became so associated with American identity that it has remained the dominant beverage in the United States ever since. To this day, Americans drink more coffee than tea, a direct legacy of that revolutionary moment when rejecting tea meant embracing coffee. But let's pause here, because the story of coffee in the Americas isn't just about politics and revolution. It's also about exploitation, slavery, and the dark underbelly of a global commodity boom. Because while Americans were drinking coffee as a symbol of freedom, the coffee itself was being produced by people who had no freedom at all. Coffee, as a crop, is finicky. It grows best in tropical and subtropical climates, at high altitudes, in rich volcanic soil. The regions that fit this description, the so-called coffee belt, include parts of Central and South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. By the 18th century, European colonial powers had begun establishing coffee plantations in their overseas territories. The French grew coffee in Haiti and Martinique. The Dutch cultivated it in Java and Suriname. The Portuguese planted it in Brazil, and the Spanish spread it across Central America. These plantations required labour, enormous amounts of labour. Coffee plants take years to mature, and once they do, the cherries must be picked by hand, processed, dried, sorted. All labour-intensive tasks. And in the 18th and early 19th centuries, that labour was provided almost entirely by enslaved people. The connection between coffee and slavery is uncomfortable, but it's essential to understanding the full story. The coffee that fueled the Enlightenment, that financed revolutions, that filled the cups in Parisian cafes and London coffee houses, was harvested by people in chains. Haiti, under French colonial rule, was one of the world's largest coffee producers in the 1700s. It was also one of the most brutal slave societies ever created. Enslaved Africans were worked to death on coffee and sugar plantations, their lives measured in years rather than decades. The mortality rate was so high that the French had to constantly import new enslaved people to replace those who died. The wealth generated by Haitian coffee flowed back to France, funding the lavish lifestyles of the French elite, and ironically, the very Enlightenment thinkers who wrote about liberty and equality. Voltaire, who sat in Café Procope sipping coffee and writing about human rights, indirectly benefited from the labour of enslaved people he never saw and rarely thought about. This contradiction, coffee as a symbol of freedom in one place and a product of slavery in another, is one of the central tensions in coffee's history. It's a reminder that global commodities are never simple, never innocent. They connect distant places and people in ways that are often invisible, but always consequential. In 1791, the enslaved people of Haiti had enough. Inspired in part by the ideals of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, they rose up in what would become the most successful slave revolt in history. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, they fought a brutal 13-year war against French, Spanish, and British forces. In 1804, Haiti declared independence, becoming the first black republic in the world and the first nation to permanently abolish slavery. It was a triumphant, world-shaking achievement, but it came at a cost. The coffee plantations were destroyed during the war, the infrastructure collapsed, and when Haiti tried to rebuild, it was crippled by international isolation and a crushing debt imposed by France in exchange for diplomatic recognition. France demanded compensation for the loss of property, meaning the enslaved people who had freed themselves. Haiti would spend the next century paying off this debt, a financial burden that devastated its economy and haunts the nation to this day. The destruction of Haiti's coffee industry had global repercussions. With Haitian coffee off the market, prices surged. Other regions rushed to fill the gap, and the biggest beneficiary was Brazil. Brazil, with its vast territory and favourable climate, was perfectly positioned to become the world's coffee powerhouse. The Portuguese had introduced coffee to Brazil in the early 1700s, but production remained relatively small for decades. After Haiti's collapse, Brazilian coffee production exploded. By the mid-1800s, Brazil was producing more coffee than the rest of the world combined. The wealth generated by coffee transformed Brazilian society, funding infrastructure, attracting immigrants, and creating a powerful coffee elite. Cities like Sao Paulo grew into metropolises on the backs of coffee profits. But here's the problem. Brazilian coffee, like Haitian coffee before it, was built on slavery. Even after Brazil formally abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1850, slavery itself continued until 1888, making Brazil the last country in the Western Hemisphere to end the practice. Millions of enslaved Africans toiled on Brazilian coffee plantations, their labour feeding the global appetite for this bitter, energising drink. When slavery was finally abolished in Brazil, the coffee industry didn't collapse. It adapted. Plantation owners, now unable to legally enslave people, turned to other sources of cheap labour. European immigrants, particularly Italians, who were lured to Brazil with promises of land and opportunity. Many found themselves trapped in debt peonage, a system barely distinguishable from slavery in practice. Meanwhile, coffee continued its march across the globe. The British, always keen to control profitable commodities, began cultivating coffee in their colonies. India, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and eventually East Africa became major producers. Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, all became coffee exporters, their economies dominated by a small class of wealthy landowners who controlled vast plantations. Indigenous people and poor farmers were often forced off their land to make way for coffee, creating social inequalities that persist to this day. The Dutch expanded coffee production in their Indonesian colonies, particularly Java, which became so synonymous with coffee that Java became American slang for the drink. The Dutch used forced labour systems, compelling local populations to grow coffee and other cash crops for export. By the late 19th century, coffee was everywhere. It was the second most valuable traded commodity in the world, after oil. It connected continents, shaped economies, and influenced the fates of nations. But that global network was built on inequality, coercion, and violence. Let's return for a moment to the coffee house. Not the elegant cafes of Paris or the intellectual hubs of London, but a different kind of space. Picture a plantation in 19th century Brazil. The sun is brutal, the air thick with humidity. Rows of coffee plants stretch as far as the eye can see, their branches heavy with red cherries. Enslaved workers move through the rows, their hands quick and practiced. They pick the cherries, drop them into baskets, move to the next plant. The work is repetitive, exhausting, endless. There is no shade, no rest, no respite. Overseers watch from horseback, whips coiled at their sides. At the end of the day, the cherries are weighed. If you haven't picked enough, you're punished. If you've picked your quota, you return to cramped quarters, eat a meagre meal, and collapse into sleep so you can do it all again tomorrow. The coffee you picked will be processed, dried, sorted, and shipped across the ocean. It will end up in a coffee house in New York or London or Paris, where someone will sip it while reading a newspaper or debating politics or writing poetry. They will never think about you. They will never know your name. You are invisible, a ghost in the supply chain. This is the other side of coffee's story, the side that doesn't make it into advertisements or nostalgic histories, the side that reminds us that every cup of coffee throughout most of history was connected to someone's suffering. But stories, like history itself, are complicated, because even as coffee was produced through exploitation, it also became a tool for connection, communication, and resistance. Coffee houses in colonial cities became spaces where abolitionists gathered, where anti-slavery pamphlets were distributed, where the moral arguments against slavery were debated and refined. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and former slave, gave speeches in coffee houses and meeting halls, often fueled by strong coffee. The networks that supported the Underground Railroad sometimes coordinated in the back rooms of coffee shops. Coffee, the product of slavery, also helped fuel the movement to end it. This paradox is quintessentially human. We are capable of great cruelty and great compassion, often simultaneously. Coffee, as a commodity and a cultural force, reflects both. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world was thoroughly addicted to coffee. Consumption was rising everywhere. New technologies, the espresso machine, the percolator, vacuum-sealed packaging, made coffee easier to brew and enjoy. Brands like Folgers, Maxwell House, and Lavazza became household names. But the fundamental inequalities in coffee production remained. The people who grew coffee were still poor. The people who sold it were still rich. And the countries that produced coffee were still, by and large, economically dependent on countries that consumed it. This dynamic would shape global politics for the next 100 years. Coffee-producing nations would struggle for fair prices, better labour conditions, and economic independence. Coffee-consuming nations would use their market power to keep prices low and supplies steady. And through it all, coffee itself remained what it had always been. A drink that brought people together, sharpened minds, and fueled conversations. Whether those conversations led to enlightenment or exploitation often depended on who was holding the cup. The 19th century transformed coffee from a luxury into a necessity, from a drink of intellectuals and revolutionaries into the fuel of industrial capitalism. This transformation happened because of three interconnected forces: industrialization, globalization, and the rise of mass marketing. And at the center of it all was a simple truth that remains valid today. The world runs better on coffee. Let's begin in the factories. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century and spread across Europe and North America throughout the 19th, fundamentally changed how people worked. For the first time in human history, large numbers of people were working not in fields or workshops, but in factories. They worked long hours, often 12 to 16 hours a day, performing repetitive tasks in noisy, dangerous conditions. Factory work was exhausting. It required sustained attention and alertness, often through the night. Workers needed energy, and they needed it cheap. Alcohol, which had long been the working-class drink of choice, was increasingly seen as a problem. A drunk worker was a dangerous worker, prone to accidents and mistakes. Coffee, on the other hand, was perfect. It kept you awake. It kept you focused. It didn't impair your judgment or slow your reflexes. Factory owners began to encourage coffee consumption, sometimes even providing it to workers. Not out of kindness, but out of efficiency. A caffeinated worker was a productive worker. This shift had profound consequences. Coffee became the drink of the working day, the beverage that powered the engine of industrial capitalism. In Britain, in Germany, in the growing industrial cities of the United States, coffee consumption skyrocketed. Workers drank it for breakfast, during breaks, sometimes all day long. And as demand grew, so did the need for supply. The question became, where would all this coffee come from, and who would grow it? The answer, as we've already begun to explore, was the tropics. But the scale was new. Coffee production in the 19th century became truly industrial, organised not around small farms, but around vast plantations designed to produce coffee for export on an unprecedented scale. Brazil remained the dominant player. By the 1850s, Brazilian coffee accounted for nearly half of global production. By the 1920s, it was closer to 80%. The state of Sao Paulo became a coffee monoculture, its economy entirely dependent on a single crop. Fortunes were made. A coffee aristocracy emerged, families with Portuguese names who controlled vast estates and wielded enormous political power. But Brazil wasn't alone. coffee spread across Latin America like a slow-moving tide. In Colombia, coffee cultivation began in earnest in the mid-1800s, concentrated in the mountainous regions where the altitude and climate were ideal. Colombian coffee, marketed as higher quality than Brazilian, began to carve out its own niche in global markets. In Central America, coffee became the foundation of entire national economies. El Salvador, by the early 20th century, derived more than 90% of its export revenue from coffee. Guatemala wasn't far behind. These were coffee republics, nations whose political and economic fortunes rose and fell with the global price of a single agricultural commodity. This created an inherent instability. When coffee prices were high, these countries thrived. Governments had money to spend on infrastructure, education, public works. But when prices dropped, as they frequently did, the results were catastrophic. Governments went bankrupt, workers starved, social unrest followed, and the prices were volatile. Coffee, like all agricultural commodities, was subject to the whims of weather, disease, and market speculation. A frost in Brazil could send global prices soaring. A bumper crop could crash them. The people who actually grew the coffee had no control over any of this. They planted, harvested, and hoped. Meanwhile, in the consuming countries, coffee was becoming big business in a different way. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of coffee companies that would dominate the industry for generations. In the United States, companies like Folgers and Maxwell House emerged as national brands. They bought coffee beans in bulk from producers, roasted them in centralized facilities, packaged them in tins and bags, and sold them through an emerging network of grocery stores and supermarkets. For the first time, coffee was standardized, branded, marketed. Maxwell House, founded in the 1890s, became one of the most recognizable names in American coffee. The brand's slogan, "Good to the last drop," allegedly approved by President Theodore Roosevelt himself during a visit to Andrew Jackson's former estate, became iconic. Whether Roosevelt actually said it is debatable. Whether it was effective marketing is not. Folgers, founded during the California Gold Rush, grew into a national powerhouse by the early 20th century. Its aggressive advertising campaigns made it a household name. Coffee was no longer just something you bought from a local roaster or brewed at home from beans of uncertain origin. It was a product, packaged and sold with all the techniques of modern capitalism. In Europe, similar transformations were underway. In Italy, espresso was perfected. The espresso machine, first patented in 1884 by Angelo Moriondo and later improved by Luigi Bezzera and Desiderio Pavoni, revolutionized how coffee was brewed and consumed. Espresso was fast, concentrated, intense. It fit perfectly with the pace of modern urban life. Italian coffee culture, which had always been sophisticated, became something of an art form. The espresso bar, the cappuccino, the ritual of standing at a counter and downing a small, strong coffee in 1 or 2 sips, these became defining features of Italian identity. And as Italian immigrants spread across the world, they brought this coffee culture with them. In Vienna, coffee houses reached their cultural zenith in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Viennese coffee house wasn't just a place to drink coffee, it was a social institution, a kind of public living room where writers, artists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens could spend hours reading newspapers, playing chess, arguing about politics and philosophy. Freud visited the Café Landmann. Klimt and Schiller were regulars at various cafes. The writer Stefan Zweig described the coffee house as a sort of democratic club open to everyone for the price of a cheap cup of coffee, where every guest can sit for hours with this little offering to talk, write, play cards, receive mail, and above all, consume an unlimited number of newspapers and journals. This was coffee as a cultural glue, a substance that facilitated human connection and intellectual exchange. It's no coincidence that Vienna, at the turn of the 20th century, was one of the most creative and intellectually vibrant cities in the world. Coffee didn't cause that vibrancy, but it certainly helped sustain it. But let's return to the global trade, because that's where coffee's political power becomes most visible. By the early 20th century, coffee was one of the most valuable commodities in international trade. It was second only to oil in terms of economic importance. The global coffee market connected producers in Latin America, Africa, and Asia with consumers in Europe and North America. And like all global markets, it was shaped by power imbalances. The producing countries were almost all colonized or economically dependent. They grew coffee because their economies had been structured, often by force, to produce cash crops for export. They had little bargaining power. They sold their coffee to intermediaries, exporters, and roasters in the consuming countries who set the prices. The consuming countries, meanwhile, reaped the benefits. They got cheap coffee, which kept their workers productive and their economies humming. They also got the profits from roasting, branding, and retailing, which were far more lucrative than simply growing the beans. This dynamic created what economists would later call a dependency relationship. Coffee-producing countries became dependent on coffee exports for their economic survival, while coffee-consuming countries became dependent on cheap coffee to fuel their industrial economies. Both sides needed each other, but the relationship was anything but equal. And when things went wrong, as they inevitably did, it was the producing countries that suffered. The first major coffee crisis of the 20th century came in the 1930s, during the Great Depression. Global demand for coffee collapsed as millions of people lost their jobs and cut back on all but the most essential purchases. Coffee prices plummeted. In Brazil, the crisis was devastating. Coffee plantations went bankrupt. Millions of bags of coffee sat unsold. In a desperate attempt to stabilize prices, the Brazilian government bought up vast quantities of coffee and destroyed it. They burned it, dumped it into the ocean, even used it as fuel for railway locomotives. Between 1931 and 1944, Brazil destroyed an estimated 78 million bags of coffee. That's billions of pounds of coffee, enough to supply the entire world for years, simply burned or thrown away because it couldn't be sold at a profitable price. Think about that for a moment. While people in coffee-producing regions were struggling to survive, their governments were destroying the very product they depended on, not because there was no demand for coffee, but because the global economic system had broken down so completely that it was more rational to destroy coffee than to sell it. This wasn't just an economic failure, it was a moral one, and it exposed the deep flaws in the global coffee trade, flaws that would persist for decades. World War II temporarily disrupted these patterns. Coffee shipments were interrupted by naval blockades and submarine warfare. Rationing was imposed in many countries. Coffee, for a time, became scarce and precious again. But after the war, demand roared back. The post-war economic boom, particularly in the United States, created an enormous appetite for consumer goods, including coffee. American coffee consumption reached all-time highs in the 1950s and 1960s. The average American drank 3 to 4 cups a day. Coffee was as American as apple pie, a staple of the suburban kitchen and the office break room. And as consumption grew, so did concerns about supply and prices. The United States government, worried about instability in coffee-producing regions and the potential for communist influence during the Cold War, began to take an active interest in the global coffee market. This brings us to one of the most important and least understood aspects of coffee's political history, the International Coffee Agreement. In 1962, under the auspices of the United Nations, coffee-producing and coffee-consuming countries negotiated a treaty designed to stabilize coffee prices. The idea was simple: set quotas for how much coffee each producing country could export, thereby preventing oversupply and price crashes. It was a kind of global cartel, and for a while it worked. Coffee prices stabilized. Producing countries had more predictable revenues. Consuming countries had more reliable supplies. Everyone, in theory, benefited. But the agreement was always fragile, always vulnerable to cheating and market pressures. And in 1989, after years of tensions and disagreements, it collapsed. The quotas were abandoned, the market was liberalized, and coffee prices, freed from artificial constraints, began a long, volatile decline. For coffee farmers, the consequences were brutal. Prices fell to historic lows. Many small farmers, unable to compete, abandoned coffee cultivation altogether. Others held on, barely surviving, hoping for better times that rarely came. Meanwhile, in the consuming countries, the coffee industry was consolidating. A handful of large corporations, Nestlé, Procter & Gamble, Sara Lee, came to dominate the market. They had the power to dictate terms, squeeze suppliers, and maximize profits. The gap between what farmers earned and what consumers paid grew wider and wider. By the end of the 20th century, the average coffee farmer in Central America or Africa earned less than $1 a day. Meanwhile, a cup of coffee in a Western cafe might cost $3 or $4. The disconnect was staggering. But something else was happening too. A counter-movement was emerging, driven by consumers who were beginning to ask questions. Where does my coffee come from? Who grew it? Were they treated fairly? This was the beginning of what would become the fair trade and specialty coffee movements, forces that would reshape the industry in the 21st century. But we're not quite there yet. For now, let's pause. Let's sit in a diner in 1950s America. The coffee is cheap, weak, served in thick ceramic mugs that are refilled endlessly by a waitress who calls everyone "hun." It's not fancy coffee, it's not artisanal, but it's everywhere, as ubiquitous as air. A truck driver sits at the counter, pouring sugar into his third cup of the morning. A businessman in a suit reads the newspaper, absently stirring his coffee. A young mother, her child asleep in a stroller, cradles her cup with both hands, savouring a few moments of quiet. They don't think about where the coffee came from. They don't know about the plantations in Colombia, or the frost in Brazil, or the collapsing prices that are ruining farmers halfway around the world. They just know that the coffee is there, hot and reliable, a small comfort in the rhythm of daily life. And in a way, that's coffee's greatest triumph and its deepest tragedy. It connects us all, but invisibly. We share in its benefits without sharing in its costs. We drink, and somewhere, someone else pays the price. The Cold War was fought on many fronts. Missiles pointed at each other across continents. Spies traded secrets in shadowy alleys. Proxy wars erupted in distant jungles and deserts. But one of the strangest and most consequential battlegrounds was the coffee farm. This might sound absurd. How could coffee, a simple agricultural product, become a weapon in the struggle between capitalism and communism? But in the logic of the Cold War, everything was connected. And coffee-producing countries, many of them poor, unstable, and resentful of decades of exploitation, were exactly the kind of places where communist revolutions might take root. American policymakers understood this. They watched nervously as leftist movements gained strength in Latin America, the region that produced most of the world's coffee. They saw what happened in Cuba in 1959, when Fidel Castro overthrew the Batista regime and established a communist government just 90 miles from Florida. And they were determined not to let it happen again. Coffee became a tool of American foreign policy. The reasoning was straightforward. If coffee farmers were prosperous and stable, they would be less likely to support communist insurgencies. Therefore, keeping coffee prices high wasn't just good economics, it was good geopolitics. This is why the United States supported the International Coffee Agreement in 1962. Yes, it stabilized prices and benefited American consumers by ensuring steady supplies. But it was also, explicitly, an anti-communist measure. Keep the coffee farmers happy, and you keep them capitalist. The strategy, for a time, seemed to work. Coffee prices remained relatively stable through the 1960s and 1970s. Latin American economies, while far from perfect, avoided complete collapse. American coffee companies continued to profit. Everyone, more or less, was satisfied. But underneath the surface, tensions were building, because the fundamental inequalities in the coffee trade hadn't gone away. They'd just been papered over with international agreements and Cold War politics. In Central America, the situation was particularly volatile. Countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua were dominated by small, wealthy elites who owned most of the land, including the coffee plantations. These elites had close ties to the United States, which supported them politically and militarily. Meanwhile, the majority of the population, farm workers, indigenous communities, poor peasants, lived in grinding poverty. Coffee wealth didn't trickle down, it concentrated at the top. And as inequality grew, so did political unrest. In Guatemala, a democratic government elected in 1951 attempted land reform, redistributing unused land from large plantations to poor farmers. The United Fruit Company, an American corporation with vast holdings in Guatemala, saw this as a threat. They lobbied the US government, painting the Guatemalan president, Jacobo Arbenz, as a communist. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup that overthrew Arbenz and installed a military dictatorship. The land reforms were reversed. The coffee plantations, along with United Fruit's banana plantations, remained in the hands of the elite. Guatemala descended into decades of civil war, a conflict that would eventually claim more than 200,000 lives. Coffee didn't cause this, but the struggle over who controlled coffee land, who profited from coffee production, and who had the power to shape coffee policy was absolutely central to the conflict. Similar dynamics played out across the region. In El Salvador, a tiny oligarchy known as the 14 Families controlled most of the coffee production. They lived in luxury while coffee workers earned starvation wages. When leftist guerrillas began organizing in the 1970s, one of their primary grievances was land inequality, particularly the concentration of coffee plantations in the hands of a few. The Salvadoran Civil War, which raged from 1980 to 1992, was fought partly in coffee fields. Villages were massacred. Coffee plantations became battlegrounds. The United States, terrified of another communist victory in the region, poured billions of dollars into supporting the Salvadoran military, even as that military committed horrific human rights abuses. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista Revolution of 1979 overthrew the Somoza dictatorship, a regime that had ruled the country for more than 4 decades with American support. The Sandinistas, inspired by socialist ideals, attempted to redistribute land, including coffee plantations, to peasant cooperatives. The United States, under President Ronald Reagan, was horrified. Reagan authorized funding and training for the Contras, a rebel army dedicated to overthrowing the Sandinistas. The result was another brutal civil war, fought largely in the coffee-growing regions of northern Nicaragua. Throughout the 1980s, Central America was engulfed in violence. Tens of thousands died, millions were displaced, and at the center of much of this conflict, often invisible to the outside world, was coffee. Because coffee plantations were valuable, they were sources of wealth and power. Controlling coffee meant controlling the economy. And in the Cold War calculus, controlling the economy meant controlling the politics. American consumers, meanwhile, were blissfully unaware. They continued to drink their coffee, brewed from beans grown in war zones, processed by workers living under military occupation, exported by governments propped up by American weapons and money. The coffee tasted the same. The price remained low. Why ask questions? But some people did ask questions, and in the 1980s, a movement began to emerge, slowly at first, that would eventually transform the coffee industry. It started with churches and solidarity groups. Activists who opposed US policy in Central America began organizing alternative trade networks. They traveled to Nicaragua, met with coffee cooperatives, and arranged to buy coffee directly from Sandinista-aligned farmers, bypassing the traditional export channels controlled by the oligarchy. This coffee was marketed as solidarity coffee or ethical coffee. The pitch was simple. By buying this coffee, you're supporting small farmers and opposing US-backed dictatorships. It was coffee with a conscience. The movement was small at first, limited mostly to progressive communities and church basements. But it planted a seed, both literally and figuratively. It introduced the idea that coffee wasn't just a commodity, but a political choice. That who you bought from mattered. That consumers had power. This idea would eventually grow into the fair trade movement, one of the most significant developments in the global coffee trade in the late 20th century. Fair trade, as a formal system, emerged in the late 1980s. The basic concept was simple: guarantee small coffee farmers a minimum price for their beans, regardless of market fluctuations. In exchange, farmers had to meet certain standards: democratic organisation, environmental sustainability, no child labour. The first fair trade coffee was certified in 1988 by a Dutch organisation called Max Havelaar. The name was taken from a 19th century novel about exploitation in the Dutch East Indies, a deliberate nod to coffee's long history of colonial abuse. Fair trade coffee began appearing in European supermarkets and specialty shops. It cost more than regular coffee, but it came with a promise. The extra money goes directly to farmers. You're not just buying coffee, you're making a difference. The movement grew. By the 1990s, fair trade coffee was available in North America. Organisations like Transfair USA began certifying coffee and educating consumers. Coffee shops started offering fair trade options, and slowly the market began to shift. But fair trade was never without its critics. Some argued that it was too small to make a real difference, that it reached only a tiny fraction of coffee farmers. Others claimed it was a marketing gimmick, a way for companies to charge more while providing minimal benefits. There were also questions about effectiveness. Did fair trade actually improve farmers' lives? Some studies said yes, pointing to higher incomes and better community infrastructure in fair trade cooperatives. Other studies were less conclusive, noting that many of the poorest farmers couldn't afford the certification costs to join fair trade in the first place. What's undeniable is that fair trade changed the conversation. It made consumers think about coffee differently. It introduced the idea of transparency, of knowing where your coffee came from and who grew it. And it paved the way for other movements, including organic coffee, direct trade, and what would eventually be called specialty coffee. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Let's go back to the late 1980s, to a coffee farm in the mountains of Nicaragua. The farmer, let's call him Miguel, wakes before dawn. He's in his 40s, though he looks older. Years of hard labour under the sun have weathered his face and bent his back. He lives in a small wooden house with his wife and 4 children. There's no electricity, no running water. The nearest town is a 2-hour walk down a muddy road. Miguel grows coffee on 3 hectares of land, about 7 acres. It's not much, but it's his. Or at least, it was. The war has made everything uncertain. Government soldiers passed through last month, demanding food and information about the rebels. The rebels came through the week before, making similar demands. Miguel tries to stay neutral, but neutrality is a luxury in a war zone. The coffee plants need constant attention, weeding, pruning, watching for disease. Miguel works from sunrise to sunset, often with his oldest son helping. His wife and daughters help during harvest season, picking the ripe cherries by hand. This year's crop looks decent. If the price is good, Miguel might earn enough to send his youngest daughter to school for another year. Maybe he can repair the roof, which leaks badly during the rainy season. Maybe. But the price is never good. The intermediaries who buy his coffee always offer less than he needs. They claim the market is down, that Brazilian coffee is flooding the world, that Miguel should be grateful to sell at all. He has no choice but to accept. He has no way to process the coffee himself, no way to export it, no access to international buyers. So he sells at whatever price is offered, and he hopes it's enough. This year, though, something different happens. A group of foreigners arrives in the village. They're working with a coffee cooperative, they say. If farmers join together, pool their resources, they can bypass the intermediaries. They can sell directly to buyers in Europe and North America who will pay a fair price. Miguel is skeptical. He's heard promises before, but he's also desperate. So he joins the cooperative. He pays a small fee, attends meetings, learns about organic farming practices and democratic decision-making. The first year is hard. The cooperative is disorganised, the logistics complicated, but slowly it begins to work. The cooperative negotiates a contract with a fair trade importer in Germany. The price is better than what Miguel has ever received. Not a fortune, but enough to make a difference. For the first time in years, Miguel feels something like hope. Maybe this will work. Maybe coffee can be a path out of poverty instead of a sentence to it. Or maybe not. The war continues.
Thank you for listening to me.